is working.
Question number 4, Dr. Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Tertiary Education, Skills and Employment and asks, by how much did wages and salaries increase between December 2008 and December 2013 according to the Labour Cost Index, and how does this compare to inflation according to the Consumer Price Index over the same period?
Honourable Stephen Joyce.
Mr Speaker, I will give the member the information he's asked for, but the House also needs to know that the Labour Cost Index he refers to is not a measure of actual wage and salary increases in the workforce. Wage and salary increases in the workforce are captured by the Quarterly Employment Survey, and in particular the measure of average weekly earnings. That has increased 16.1% since December 2008. The Labour Cost Index, on the other hand, is a statistical construct designed to measure inflation in the labour market. It ignores pay increases that is due to increased performance of productivity or for promotion or for taking on extra responsibilities or for changing jobs. The LCI increased 9.3% since December 2008, which, not surprisingly, is similar to the other measure we have of inflation, which is the CPI, which increased 10.8% over the same period.
Supplementary.
Supplementary question, Dr. Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. So can the Minister confirm that the Labour Cost Index went up by 9.3% under the National Government over this period, while inflation increased by 10.5% over the same period, meaning that people's pay packets have gotten smaller in real terms under the current government?
Honourable Stephen Joyce.
Mr Speaker, no. And with the greatest respect to the member, he's being a bit tricky here because the Labour Cost Index does not measure changes in wages and salaries and earnings over the period. It mentions the pure inflation in the labour market for somebody who doesn't get any pay increases from improved productivity or anything like that. The QES is actually the method by which changes in employment, total weekly gross earnings, total weekly paid hours, average hourly and average weekly earnings are reflected. I think the member does know that because he's asked questions on the QES previously. Today, interestingly, he's only asking about the LCI.
Order. Order. Supplementary question, Dr. Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Is the Minister aware of Statistics New Zealand's user guide for Statistics New Zealand's wage and income measures, the 3rd edition, which says that, and I quote, if you are interested in changes in earnings across time, the Labour Cost Index is a better measure than the Quarterly Employment Survey?
Honourable Stephen Joyce.
Mr Speaker, I haven't got that particular example in front of me, but I can tell the member on page 15 of the Quarterly Employment Survey, which has just been released last week, helpfully on the same day of the LCI, which may be why the members confused it. The unadjusted LCI measures changes in salary and ordinary time wage rates for a fixed quantity of labour. No, just correct, Mr Robertson, in this case. It fixes the relative importance of industries and occupations, but does not fix the market rates and so on in terms of the Quarterly Employment Survey. Again, successive governments have used the Quarterly Employment Survey for calculating things such as superannuation and paid parental leave, because that measures the change in actual earnings of New Zealanders, and if the member wasn't being tricky, that's what he would use.
Supplementary.
Order. Order.
Supplementary.
Order. Supplementary question, Dr. Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Does the Minister not understand what Statistics New Zealand is saying in the quote from their own documents, where they say that the Labour Cost Index is the official measure of the change in earnings over time, not the Quarterly Employment Survey, which is why they put it in their documents, because the QES will produce misleading results, such as showing an increase in the average wage when lots of low-wage jobs are lost, as has happened under this government.
Honourable Stephen Joyce.
Well, Mr Speaker, I disagree with the member on a couple of points there. Firstly, if he has noticed in the previous question, we were able to show the increase in jobs over the period that this government has been in office, certainly in recent times and since Budget 2010. But again, I think the member is, I'm sorry, being deliberately disingenuous here, because the labour cost index is about a measure of pure inflation in the labour market for a fixed and equal quantity of labour which doesn't change. In reality, people's incomes go up because they are more productive. It goes up because they have been given a promotion. It goes up because they have changed jobs. That is captured in the quarterly employment survey, and that is the actual measure of wages for New Zealanders and how they've changed over time.
Supplementary question, Dr. Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Who is right? Statistics New Zealand, which produces both the labour cost index and the quarterly employment survey, and says, as I quote again, if you are interested in changes in earnings over time, the labour cost index is a better measure than the quarterly employment survey. Is Statistics New Zealand right about the measure, the right measure, or is the Minister right because he seems to know more than Statistics New Zealand?
Honourable Stephen
Well, Mr.
Joyce.
Speaker, the member and I can exchange these phrases as often as we like. The unadjusted LCI, according to Statistics New Zealand, measures changes in salary and ordinary time wage rates for a fixed quantity of labour. It does not fix the quality of labour within occupations. As that changes, that actually changes with the QES. So, Mr. Speaker, perhaps to try and resolve this, we could make a suggestion. If the member believes that the LCI is the correct way that we should calculate the increase in wages of New Zealanders, then perhaps he would like to commit to using that calculation for the calculation of New Zealand super, which would mean we would all have to reduce New Zealand super to be back to the LCI level. And perhaps he'd like to commit to that for paid parental leave, because I think regardless of how the Greens spin this, the reality is that when in government, Labor and the Greens use the quarterly employment survey because that's what measures New Zealanders' wages.
Supplementary question, Tim McIndoe.
Speaker, in light of the previous member's questions, can the Minister clarify for us what in legislation has been used as the definitive measure of wage and salary growth, and what in particular that measure tells us about average weekly earnings?
Honourable Stephen Joyce.
Mr. Speaker, the New Zealand Superannuation and Retirement Income Act, passed under the previous government, uses a measure of wage growth to set the floor for New Zealand super payments. That measure is average weekly earnings from a thing known as the Quarterly Employment Survey. Also, the Parental Leave and Employment Protection Act, which was amended by the previous government, uses a measure of wage growth to increase the payment rate for paid parental leave. That measure is average weekly earnings from the Quarterly Employment Survey. Average weekly earnings have gone up 2.8% in the last year compared to inflation of 1.6%. Once again, if the Greens and their friends are going to be consistent, they should go out and tell superannuitants that they would intend to give them less super from a Labor Green government because they're changing the way they measure wage growth in the New Zealand economy.
Order. Supplementary question, Dr. Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, then, could the Minister tell the House how Statistics New Zealand has got it wrong when they say in their user guide for Statistics New Zealand's wage and income measures, 3rd edition, the most recent edition, when Statistics New Zealand says, if you are interested in changes in earnings across time, the labour cost index is a better measure than the quarterly employment survey. Can the Minister explain how exactly Statistics New Zealand has got it wrong and he's got it right?
Honourable Stephen Joyce.
Well, I can only quote Statistics New Zealand to the member, and I suppose we could go on all afternoon if we like, but the labour cost index, according to the Statistics New Zealand, measures, as I say, changes in salary and wage rates for a fixed quantity and quality of labour input. That does not, it's a statistical construct which determines inflation in the labour market. What it doesn't determine is how much people get paid, because in fact the quality and quantity of their labour doesn't stay unchanged over a time period. They get promotions, they change jobs, they work more hours, all those things, and that adds up to their quarterly employment earnings, which is reflected on the QES. Now, if the member wants to ask another 5 sups, so we could save the House's time, and I'll just table the answers the same way.
Supplementary question, Dr. Russell Norman.
Well, given that the Minister thinks that he's right and Statistics New Zealand is wrong, Does he also believe that he's right and everybody else in New Zealand is wrong when most New Zealanders' lived experience is that under this government they have struggled to get ahead as prices have gone up and wages have not kept up with rising prices, because that is exactly what the statistics produced by Statistics New Zealand shows. The labour cost index is falling behind inflation.
Honourable Stephen Joyce.
I'm sorry, Mr Speaker, the member is simply wrong in this case, and he really does need to go and get some advice. The simple reality of the situation is he's wrong on so many levels, because firstly, wages have been going up, real after-tax wages have been going up faster than inflation in this government by some margin. Under the previous government, it might have looked like their wages were going up, but as we all know, their inflation was much higher. And if the member can't make a distinction between inflation and wages, then we really do have a problem.
Question number 5, Honourable David Parker.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister of Finance. Does he stand by his statement, quotes, "I think there's going to be an expectation, particularly for those people with skills that are in demand, that they will be doing better than zero pay increases"?
Honourable Stephen Joyce.
Yes, Mr Speaker, on behalf of the Minister of Finance.